You remember I challenged Dr. Avalos to discharge his share of the burden of proof tonight, to show us that either the resurrection narratives are false or give us some better explanation of them. He hasn't done that in tonight's debate. At best, he's tried to neutralize the ground, to show there's no historical evidence for the resurrection, but that doesn't show that, therefore, this is a fiction. So he still has yet to bear his burden of proof in tonight's debate. Now, have I been able to succeed in bearing my share of the burden? Well, I argued first that there are 4 facts that have been established about Jesus of Nazareth. And he dropped his point about textual purity in the last work. We saw that the text of the New Testament is 99% established, and that indeed denying the text of the New Testament would undermine his own work in ancient healthcare systems. But now he says, what about this problem with Matthew 27? Do you believe it's historical or not? Well, I'll repeat, I'm not sure. It depends on whether or not this is meant to be apocalyptic imagery by Matthew or a real, actual event. And I'm open-minded about this. Now, he says, but it is the same verb, agerein, that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15 to describe the resurrection. And it uses the word soma, body, the same word that you use or describe in 1 Corinthians 15 for Christ's resurrection. Well, obviously, but the point is not that agerein and soma show the historicity of these events. Rather, it means that what is being described is a physical resurrection. And that is the only kind of resurrection that Judaism knew. This has been demonstrated anew by N.T. Wright in his massive study, The Resurrection of the Son of God, released last summer. This is what Wright says. Let us be quite clear at this point. We shall see that when the early Christians said resurrection, they meant it in the sense that it bore both in paganism, which denied it, and Judaism, which affirmed it. Resurrection meant bodily resurrection, and that is what the early Christians affirmed. So these verbs go to show that when a person speaks of resurrection, you're talking about something that happens to the body. You're not talking about the immortality of the soul or something of that sort. But that doesn't decide the issue of whether or not the language being used here is apocalyptic and symbolic or not. Now he says, well, what does it mean to say that something is apocalyptic? It just means it's more supernatural. No, not at all. Apocalyptic language will use figurative speech that isn't meant to be taken literally, like the sun turning dark and the moon turning to blood, or in the book of Revelation, dragons crawling up out of the oceans and so forth. When I was a young Christian, I used to think that the book of Revelation meant that actual 7-headed beasts would crawl out of the seas someday and destroy the earth. What I came to understand is that in apocalyptic literature, these are symbols or figures of speech for example, nation states in the book of Revelation. And I'm frankly not sure whether Matthew means us to understand his resurrection of the saints as literal, historical information or as symbolic or figurative. But what's quite clear, as I said, is that in the Markan account of the empty tomb, there is no apocalyptic language. When I say that this is simple and shows no signs of legendary embellishment, I mean that there is an utter absence of theological and apologetical motifs that characterize later legendary accounts, like Jesus being the king, Jesus raising the people in the intermediate state from the dead along with him, with his triumph over the enemies and so forth. It's a stark and simple historical account. It's not cast in apocalyptic imagery. So I think Dr. Avalos is simply quite wrong in saying that the case stands or falls on this single passage in Matthew. Nothing in my case depends upon how you treat that, either historically or apocalyptically as an image. Now he says, but what about this point about the first day of the week? This is an argument I give in my book that I didn't use tonight to show the earliness of the Markan account. The Markan account uses a phrase in Greek, the first day of the week, teimia ton sabbaton, which is awkward in Greek. But when you translate it back into Aramaic, it is perfectly smooth and legitimate Aramaic or Hebrew. Teimia ton sabbaton, when translated into Aramaic, is b'chath b'shabbatha. And this, he asked for the text where this can be found. In the second Targum of Esther, chapter 2, verse 9, the same phrase is used. You can also find it in Hebrew as b'achad b'shabbat. And this is awkward in Greek because mia is a cardinal rather than an ordinal number. It means the one rather than the first. And Sabbaton is the word for the Sabbath, not the word for the week. And yet it's used here to be the first day of the week. But in Aramaic or Hebrew, this is perfectly good Aramaic or Hebrew to say b'chaf b'shabbatha. So I think this simply supports my point and shows the primitiveness of the Markan tradition, that we're in contact here with the original language spoken by the disciples. Well, he hasn't responded to the facts concerning Jesus' burial, the discovery of his empty tomb. With respect to the appearances, he says, but the appearance to James in Paul's list doesn't say that, or isn't based upon James's dying for his faith, but the very passage he read from Josephus, where it refers to James, does say that during a lapse in the civil government, the high priest convened the Sanhedrin and they stoned James to death. Why? Well, because James was the leader of the New Testament church, as we know from the book of Acts. So he was martyred for his faith in Jesus Christ. Why? Because James, the younger brother of Jesus, saw a resurrection appearance of Jesus, as Paul says, and that brought his conversion. This is one of the most powerful evidences for the resurrection. I mean, most of us have brothers. What would it take to convince you that your brother is the Lord so that you would be ready to die for that belief as James was? Hans Grass, a great New Testament scholar from Germany, has said that one of the greatest proofs of the resurrection of Jesus is the conversion of James, the younger brother of Jesus. Well, then the question is, what's the best explanation of these facts? And I think we saw that Dr. Avalos' own empirical rationalism is overly restrictive. It would deny all sorts of knowledge that we have. Secondly, it's self-refuting. He says you can't use something to refute itself. Sure you can. It's self-referentially incoherent. That is to say, if it's false, it's false. If it's true, it's false. It's like somebody saying, I cannot speak a single word of English. You see, if it's true, it's false. In the same way, his epistemology is simply self-refuting. That's why it's overwhelmingly rejected today. So you cannot restrict rational belief to just verifiable statements and logically demonstrable statements. I would argue that belief in the resurrection of Jesus is what Dr. Avalos calls a reasonable belief. It is inferred on the basis of the evidence. He did not respond to my point that his principle about only appealing to known causes is simply the same as saying hypothesis shouldn't be ad hoc, and I agreed with that, but you can't harden it into a dogmatic presupposition or you inhibit science. And secondly, that we do have independent evidence for the existence of God. So if you believe in God, then you are explaining the resurrection in terms of an entity that you believe or know to exist, namely God. And as a theist who has good reasons to believe in God, I think I'm therefore perfectly rational in believing what the original disciples proclaimed, that
Please
God
conclude your remarks.
raised Jesus from the dead.